We are, folks. Let's get started.
You get a microphone for a reason.
There's my microphone, okay. Good morning to you hardcore puppet friends. Welcome to the museum. Got a couple people rolling on in. It's super special to have you all here from near and far. Welcome to the Puppeteers of America official Puppet Homecoming 2022, Northeast Mid-Atlantic Regional Festival. This is for you folks. This is for our membership. These are for volunteers and board members and presidents and officers of all kind and aficionados and puppet people across the spectrum. I'm super thrilled to have the opportunity to present this festival. My name is Brendan Schweda. I'm the festival director. I'm currently serving as the Mid-Atlantic Regional Director for Puppeteers of America. And since well, you're next, Artie. You're gonna be. Since 2018, I sunk my creative teeth into developing the Puppets Come Home series here at Coney Island, USA. So that's been an opportunity to meet so many folks, to work with so many folks, not only from the metro New York City area, but abroad, as we all entered cyberspace over the past couple of years. Some of you I'm meeting for the first time in person, which is super special. I'll probably have to set a timer on myself at some point, because when I get started, there's really no stopping me. But there's a lot of, we have two very special guests who are going to come up here to add to these opening remarks, this opening ceremony. And at about 11 o'clock, we can all head over to the Shooting Gallery Annex, the adjacent building owned by this organization, where our festival exhibit is, I think, currently being installed. And they should be ready for us by 11. But I'll start by welcoming you again to Coney Island. And let me just take an opportunity. You may have seen this posted when you came in, but here we are. This is a live cam. This is Coney Island, USA. I'm going to go up here. I'm going to show you where we are. Well, that's the front. This is the center. We are right here. These two windows are these two windows.
Smile!
Someone shove your face against the thing. The Wonder Wheel, the iconic, here I'll do it in the mic for the, so we have here this is our building, this is us right here. The iconic parachute jump I'll come back to in a moment. The Luna Park 2.0, if you get to spend some time in the museum, and if I have a moment at any point this weekend, you're here and you want to know, I love talking about the history. We have a special gallery in the back of this room that shows the three iconic amusement parks that define the idea, the fantasy, the legend, the truth about what Coney Island was at the turn of the last century. There's really a 10-year period from about 1897, when Steeplechase Park is erected, through 1903. The first Luna Park is erected directly across the street. It'd be right over here, the original Luna Park, with a similar facade but different guts. 1903 Luna Park, 1904 Dreamland, all the way down toward the aquarium. The original Steeplechase was over here where the ballpark is. There were three independent mammoth amusement parks. So Coney Island, people say Coney Island, they think maybe like Disney World. It is not one singular operation, which is one of the things that makes it so special. It is multiple companies, multiple people, multiple dreams, hearts, ideas, efforts that are facilitating the ebb and flow of what this place is. It's like a perpetual frontier. It starts as sand dunes in the early 1800s. In the mid 1800s, it catches on that this is the closest outlet to the seaside from New York City. So people like Walt Whitman famously would come and have clam bakes on the beach, and then as more and more people and as more people with money showed up, they erected some hotels, and then by the end of the 1800s, it really starts becoming Coney Island with eateries and some attractions, a time when people are borrowing ideas from the world's fairs. So like I said, 1897, the first like prototypical, what a lot of historians will identify as kind of the prototypical amusement park. You know, previously in Europe and in other places, you had like pleasure gardens and amusement attractions, but steeplechase is one of the very first times you get one enclosed property where you pay one entrance for multiple rides, which is what kind of makes it special in that way. But that's a long time ago. So from 1897 through 1911, when Dreamland burns down, is kind of the golden age. Coney Island goes through different eras from like the 20s, 30s through the 1950s. It's identified as the Nickel Empire. When it starts at the turn of the last century as more of a luxury destination with people from all over the world, it becomes for everyone. So instead of on high dollar marks, they focus on volume. Everything's a nickel in the Nickel Empire. A hot dog costs a nickel, the rides cost a nickel, the subway ride to get you here will cost a nickel. And people came in droves. You'll see some photos of the people massing on the beach. And I think personally it boils down to the beach, as it were, that kind of the elemental impetus to get people to congregate down here, and the rides and the dining and everything else is just icing on the cake. Coney Island goes through some hard times in the 1960s and 70s, where a lot of the enterprise and industry of the amusement park was dark, except for places like the lone standing Astroland. Astroland goes down in 2008. The local community, spearheaded by people like the Coney Island USA co-founder and former artistic director Dick Zigan, spearheaded a Save Coney Island movement. People were afraid that they would lose the identity of this place forever. Fortunately, no, we don't want to go to focus features, but I'll let you ride. I'll just talk. So fortunately, the city decided, people like Mayor Bloomberg decided to invest in Coney Island. So you get Luna Park 2.0, which is run by an Italian ride manufacturer, Zamperla, and other businesses are kind of popping up, and restaurants are going up and down, but we have the ballpark and the aquarium is back in full swing. So welcome to Coney Island, long and short. Puppet history, in terms of what Coney Island is, there's two real kind of puppet anchors that I've identified in Coney, one being Punch and Judy on the beach. Punch and Judy was all over the beach and boardwalk in the late 1800s. Just as it was a seaside attraction in England, was a seaside attraction here in Coney. Just for your little history, for those history buffs, near the spot. This is not here, this is in England. Punch's Puppet, near this spot, Punch's Puppet Show was first performed in England and witnessed by Samuel Pepys in 1662 in Covent Garden. One of the early Cruikshank illustrations, although this is not, this is, I guess, Steve, this is one of like the first real the earliest documented collection of Punch play that we have, although just one iteration, because every Punch professor had his own way to do it. So a little typical Punch seaside image, followed by Punch as depicted in Coney Island. This is a painting by Samuel S. Carr from the 1880s. So this is what you may have seen if you were on the Coney Island beach at the end of the 19th century. We have Punch and Judy and Baby. Your typical red and white striped booth. You'll see one of those if you're sticking around. You'll see a Wonder Sparks booth tomorrow in our Punch block. Punch is also a sideshow attraction, as it were. So there's another, Coney Island USA is home to not only Puppets Come Home, which is a super recent program. You have the Coney Island Circus Sideshow, which was kicked off in 1985. The Mermaid Parade, the famous annual Mermaid Parade, kicked off in 1983. They have Burlesque at the Beach and a film festival. But the sideshow has been the kind of bedrock of the programming here. And Punch was another sideshow attraction, like the exotic Punch and Judy from all the old London Punch and Judy with all these other sideshow banners depicting freaks, wonders, and human curiosities, as it were. Another Punch and Judy banner here. I like this one. Some of your typical characters with the devil and so forth. So yeah, Punch is appropriate in Coney Island for all of Coney Island's sideshow history and amusement. Little Jack Ketch. Punch and Judy fought for a pie. Punch gave Judy a knock in the eye. And so it goes. Right? Just a taste of these characters. Of course, and the big grin, celebrated in England 10 years ago. So this means 350 years. Punch's 360th birthday, as it were. So we've got some of you are performing. Got Nancy Sander will be doing some Punch for us tomorrow. Looking forward to that. Here's their birthday anniversary. Okay, so just a final note on Punch in the connection to Coney. You may be familiar with the Coney Island funny face plastered all over Coney Island, and it was born in Steeplechase Park in the late 1800s. The founder of Steeplechase Park was a fellow named George C. Tillieu, who grew up in Coney Island. He would have seen, as a little kid, Punch and Judy all over the beach. So I'm just inclined to think that the unnatural grin of the funny face is probably connected to Punch's unnatural grin, which is just kind of takes home, makes a real puppet home here in Coney. These are some Punch puppets from Johnny Eck, a very noted sideshow performer who can be seen in Todd Browning's 1920s film Freaks. This is Coney Island Punch magician and Punch professor Al Flosso, known as the Coney Island Fakir, with his Punch puppets. Al Flosso brought the Punch tradition in Coney from the 1800s into the 20th century. And then let me just move this for you quickly. Flosso notably was part of the festival program at the New Morningside Hotel in Hurleyville, New York, June 24th to 29, 1963. Here's the full programming. Who can I isolate here? Yeah, Bradshaw, you can see Jerry Jewell, Bonin, Don Saline, Ray Mount. Who else do we have there? Ron Herrick. If we go, there's one more. I got advance one. So on the Wednesday evening performance, Mac Ruile, Sicilian Theater, Nancy Cole Guignol, Al Flosso, Magic, and Punch and Judy, Tom Harrison Variety, followed by Puppet Films. So this, Leah Wallace, if anyone's familiar with Pagogny. Again, Jerry Jewell up here. So this was a festival that was directed by Jim Henson. So there's Coney has got a little place in puppet history, in Puppeteers of America history. So super excited that Al Flosso was represented there.
And Bread and Puppet was there too.
Were they really?
Yeah.
Amazing.
The Muppets is listed on the bottom there.
Right.
Frank Paris.
Yeah, so Jim Henson presented this nightclub performance. I can only imagine some kind of fantastic variety show.
Knife throwing.
Right. If that's not, we have a knife thrower here in Coney. I mean, you know. Rufus Rose giving a lecture here.
Oh my goodness.
So this was not the last. I guess this was not in New York City, but you know, a New York P of A festival. I'll be happy to pass this along to any interested parties, but to give everyone else some time, I better shuffle along here because I'll just get lost in this history. Come back to and move right along here. So fast forward to the early 1970s, Bread and Puppet had a home here. This facade was directly across the street, this big beautiful puppet head. When you meet Amy Trumpeter not too long from now. I believe she recalls who built this head. Amy was here visiting. She did not perform with Bread and Puppet, but Bread and Puppet came in performing their very socially conscious pieces like Revenge of the Law, about police conflict and racial tensions right here in the heart of the amusement district. One of the folks, and here's the other, this is actually a really beautiful shot. This is the facade of their space. They had people from the neighborhood coming, building puppets on a regular basis, doing their shows. It was only there for a couple of years, but when I made a visit to the Bread and Puppet Farm a few years ago, Peter Schumann spoke very fondly of his time here in Coney Island. And of course today we have some folks like the Box Cutter Collective, who you will see tonight and come out of the Bread and Puppet tradition right back here in Coney Island. Paul Zaloom, the Obie Award-winning performance artist and host of Beekman's World and Bread and Puppet performer, spent some time in Coney Island performing at that time. Here's a loom. So this organization, Coney Island USA, was co-founded by Dick Ziggin in 1980. The first official Coney Island USA event was held around the corner at a wax museum called the World in Wax Museum. There's a display case right over there with some wax heads and paraphernalia from that wax museum. The proprietor was Lily St. Angelo, an elderly woman who had it since the 1920s. Dick Ziggin and other young artists in the early 80s befriended her. They formed this organization. They presented their first event on Halloween, 1981, and the opening act was Paul Zaloom in the world of wax. Here's just some more. This is a contact sheet courtesy of the Coney Island Museum with a bunch of his object performance. It's a New York City scene. I see this is a New York City apartment building, and this is the subway. There's debris and cars going up and down the subway. This is 1981. This is Halloween 81. And then I'll kind of wrap things up here. You might recognize these if you've been to the Ballard Institute, presided over by John Bell in Connecticut. The Ballard, in their lobby, has a beautiful display of international puppets. One of them is this collection of puppets from the famous Charles Ludlam of the Ridiculous Theater Company here in New York. So Ludlam did a very notable Punch and Judy show, and Ludlam was a friend of Coney Island USA in its early days, and he was also one of the people in that World in Wax performance. This is Charles Ludlam and his partner, Everett Quentin Everett. This is back at the Halloween show in 81, and these are his punch puppets right in the Ballard. And what else can I say? I'll end on this. Before I pass it over to Steve, you saw the parachute jump in the live stream and in the landscape, and you couldn't miss it if you drove in this way. But in 1939, during the New York World's Fair, so incidentally, I know Steve is going to touch upon this, the 1939 World's Fair, the last time that Puppeteers of America had a festival in New York City, is also the place where the Coney Island parachute jump was born. This is the parachute jump in Queens, clad in some Lifesavers advertisements. It was a functioning ride. It was a functioning ride when it was here too, through the mid-1960s. But here it is at the World's Fair, at the same time that all of these puppeteers and Puppeteers of America folks were enjoying the World's Fair. So later on this afternoon, Heather Henson and Amy Trumpeter will be spearheading our parade from the parachute jump back toward this venue. So that's a taste of where we came from, and I will hand it over to the past president of Puppeteers of America, the current editor of the Puppetry Journal, Mr. Steve Abrams.
This is an earlier version of this PowerPoint. I kept fiddling with it. There's so much history, so I'm not sure what's on here, to tell you the truth. I think I should go way back to 100 years, or maybe even a little more, 2022. 1914, a puppeteer named Remo Bufano, who was born in Italy when he was 20 years old, did a puppet show on McDougal Street at a place that provided cultural things for Italian immigrants. And the next year, 1921, he also was very interested in theater. He had his first Broadway credit as an actor in 1915. This was before another immigrant arrived named Tony Sarg, who actually his parents were German. He traveled around the world. He had done puppetry in London. So the two fathers of American puppetry were essentially immigrants, which is very much a part of the New York story. That's how a lot of people ended up here. So it goes way, way, way back to the beginning. And then, so some of them had permanent theaters. This is a list of about 12 theaters that existed in New York. The ones with the asterisk, C, the Cottage, and the one in Brooklyn are still here. Bill Baird's theater ran for about 10 years. I'll get to some of these, but these were all permanent playhouses that you could go to for a brief time or a longer time. And because New York is the place everybody wants to come, a lot of people performed here, which is a lot part of New York puppet history, but are not from New York. Back in a very influential company from Italy was Piccoli. Then the Salzburg came here in '51, and they sold out theater after they made many, many, many trips to New York. They were very influential. Yves Joly did stuff with his hands, and he came here once in 1951 and played a little cabaret in downtown. And he was very influential in bringing abstract puppetry in. So that was his only visit here. Philippe Jean-Thibault Bratzoff are very, very famous. Bruce Schwartz was a California puppeteer, but he did a show in the Village in maybe around 1980. Jim Henson was very, very fond of his work, and he had Bruce on his show. Sid and Marty Croft were also California, but they performed here. And Bert Tillstrom, I've Ronnie Burkett on there because he worked for Bill Baird very briefly, and then his show came here, of course. And Bert Tillstrom was very rooted in Chicago, but has a lot of important New York credits. So in the beginning, in Little Italy, there were these Sicilian marionettes that did these, there were many, many episodes. So you would come back night after night after night to see these shows. And Remo Bufano was very interested in the Sicilian marionettes. And there was a permanent theater in Little Italy by the Manteos in 1923. And it moved several times. It moved in 27. And I think they were also at the festival in 63. I think Jim brought them into the festival in 1963. So I mentioned Remo Bufano. There's a guide to Greenwich Village in 1918, and it lists Remo Bufano's puppet theater. He always had a very small puppet theater and studio in the Village over many, many years. And he probably has more Broadway credits than any other puppeteer. And he pioneered big puppets. He did big puppets, he did small puppets. He did a version of Master Peter's Puppet Show in 1926. And then in 1931, he did Oedipus Rex at the Metropolitan Museum, Opera, with these 12-foot puppets that are quite famous. So he and Sarg were sort of, I don't know if they were friendly or competitive, but they were both in New York all through the 20s and 30s. So this is one of Tony Sarg's last show, Robin Hood. Sarg even fooled around with puppetry films quite early. This is a shadow puppet film he did. And then Sarg invented the balloons, which became part of New York's history, and people think of them as upside-down puppets. And they were started in 1927, and one of the people who worked on those was Bill Baird. Now, 1925, this is almost forgotten. These you could say socialists. They were really communists. These Jewish communist puppeteers had a puppet theater. It was Yiddish theater. You know, you've heard of the Yiddish theater in New York. They opened a theater in the Lower East Side in 1925. And they were one of the first puppet companies from America. They went back to Europe. They performed in Poland. They performed in Russia. And so they did their work from 1925 to 1935, but they had this little permanent theater on the Lower East Side in the 20s. These are the Oedipus puppets that I mentioned. They're just gorgeous. About half of them are in Detroit and half of them are owned by Columbia University. Oh, and I didn't mention 1922. So 1922, Sarg's performing, Bufano's performing, Manteo's performing. And by coincidence, the founder of Puppeteers of America and the great, great historian of puppets, Paul McFarlane, did his first puppet show where he's very known for his Detroit roots. Where did he go to school? Columbia. His introduction to puppets was in 1922 at Columbia University. So Bufano headed the WPA in New York that produced lots and lots of puppet shows. And this gorgeous, gorgeous poster was from a show that never happened. There was a lot of political stuff and what should be in and what should be out in the WPA, and he was planning to do this famous Czech play, RUR, which stands for robots, and he quit, and the show was never performed. So that's when he left the WPA. But there were designs and everything for this, but that's from 1937. Oh, so the other puppeteer, so Sarg was so good, he opened up his school in 1922. A lot of people not only took his courses, but soon copied him and went into competition with him. So Sue Hastings was a student of Sarg and then formed her own company, which then was very, very successful, had Broadway credits, and actually became a major rival to Sarg. So in the 30s, you have Sarg, you have Hastings, you have Bufano, and then there were these guys from California who kept trying to make it in New York. And that's, so these three, and by the way, they're part of queer history too, because and so they opened Little Theater in California, but every season, this is from 1932, they were here in 34, this is at the Barbizon in New York. They had several New York seasons before they finally settled in California and opened up their theater in the 40s. But this is them from, and they did, their work was for adults. So that brings us to 39, the only festival that was in New York, and they came here because of the World's Fair as well. And so there was a day at the festival where about 60 puppeteers traipsed out to the fairgrounds. And so Remo Bufano was part of that. He introduced the Manteos. Remo Bufano did a puppet presentation at the Pharmacy Pavilion with, again, very, very large puppets. There was a puppeteer named Lou Boonin who did films. He had a film in that festival. And there were a lot of puppeteers who didn't really mix with other puppeteers. There was a great puppeteer named Dorothy Zakonic, and her puppet company was called Suzari. And the only time she attended a festival was this one, because it was in New York. You know, there's a lot of New Yorkers who don't like to leave New York. They don't like to get on a train and go to Detroit or Chicago or whatever, especially in those days. I guess they feel if they leave New York, something terrible will happen to them. So Suzari, she had a great, great, great company. They toured, they went to schools, they toured all over the place. That was Nick Coppola's teacher. This story about her amazes me. In 1931, a 19-year-old Jewish girl from Brooklyn decided she wanted to do wood carving, a little unusual, and she told her parents she wanted to go to Europe to learn wood carving. So she went to Europe. 19-year-old solo by herself, little Jewish girl, went to Germany and Austria and Czechoslovakia and appeared at the Unima Festival in Czechoslovakia, and then had to get the hell out of there because Hitler was coming everywhere and she had to come home. And then she went on to form her puppet company, which went from the 30s all the way through 1962. So, and Nick talks about her quite fondly. She was apparently quite remarkable, and you might be shocked, but a little on the eccentric side. So now we're up to around the 1940s. Frank Paris was actually born in Texas, did some work with the El Puppeteers, but he came to New York. And in 1940, well, everything changed in 1948. There was this new thing that came on TV. And in 1948, Howdy Doody went on the air with a puppet by Frank Paris. The little details, contract details, were not precise, and he basically took his puppet home and wouldn't let them use it again. He got fired. They wouldn't use his version of Howdy Doody. And there was an out-of-court settlement with Frank Paris. And then the Howdy Doody that we all knew came to exist after some mistake. They had him in bandages for 1 or 2, and then they revealed the new Howdy Doody. And I don't know if it was the proceeds from the lawsuit, but Frank Paris bought a house in Greenwich Village, and was he was a very charismatic solo puppeteer. He didn't work with a proscenium. You could see him. He was very handsome. And he worked at places like Radio City. He did world tours. He was a superb marionette person. And he lived in New York from 1956 until sometime in the 70s. And he performed at that festival in '63 as well. This is an almost forgotten, this is not important. This is like one of these little trivial things. There was this great surrealist artist, Kurt Seligman, and this guy from Buffalo, New York, settled in New York, and he did this little puppet show at a little cabaret called Spivey's Roof in New York in the 50s. And so these puppets exist. This was a little show that was done in a little cabaret in New York in 1947. And then he did a puppet company in 1948. They didn't make money. And then he opened a famous art gallery. He was friends with Jackson Pollock, the great, great artist. And Jackson Pollock sort of dug what he was doing. Jackson Pollock said, "Hey, I made this puppet for you. Let me give it to you." And that puppet disappeared, unfortunately. Then so during the war, it was interesting. They started sending out puppeteers on the USO to perform for the troops. So this was not a kiddie audience. These were grown-up puppets. And so some of the people who went out were these women who were New Yorkers who were trained in modern dance as well as puppetry. And from 1950 to 1960, Leah Wallace and her sister had the Greenwich Village Puppet and Dance Center in, guess where? Greenwich Village. And Lee went on to be a greatly, greatly loved member of, she was one of the founders of the New York Guild. When I first was a young artist reading about puppetry, and I read this article in Puppetry Journal, Lee was writing about the avant-garde things that you could go see. And here was this old lady seeing all the things that I was digging at the same time, which really quite amazed me. That's abstract. That's from the 1950s. This is another puppeteer who performed at a little club in the village. There was a piece called George and Martha. And the woman, Martha, was represented by this feather boa. That was the entire puppet. There wasn't a lot of puppetry in New York in the 50s. They were around. The Broadway production, Baird did a couple of Broadway shows. In 1961, this opened on Broadway, and it was like the first Broadway show to really feature. It was very, very important. And the puppets in Carnival were actually based on Bert Tillstrom's puppets. That's what inspired the show. Oh, back to 53. In 1953, the 450th anniversary, the two networks did something together, NBC and CBS. They never, ever did that. This anniversary show went out to 60 million people in 1953. And guess who was invited to be on the show? Bert Tillstrom. That was the first time in that show, Ethel Merman and Mary Martin, the two reigning divas of Broadway, did a very, very long duet together. And then Burr had to come on, and the puppets say, "Boy, how do you follow that?" So, and in 53, Burr also performed in New York, and he came back to New York later, but that was a big New York credit for him in 53. Also in New Yorkers, I don't know when she went to Hollywood, but Sherry Lewis's show came on to TV in around 1960. Her father was a magician, and her first shows were done from New York as well. Then we get to Baird, who was around from 1928 to 1988. He had a very long career. A lot of people worked for him. And there was a time when he was the most famous puppeteer in the country, without a doubt. This is one of his more notable plays that played Broadway. He did all kinds of puppets. He didn't just do marionettes. There's a rod puppet. And this was 1964 New York World's Fair at the Chrysler Pavilion. He did a puppet show that used all auto parts. So this is Ollie Oil Can. There were the motor blockets instead of the rockets. And since it was the World's Fair, he had to hire tons and tons and tons of puppeteers to work for him to make this happen, many performances a day. So that was a big year for him. The year before, everything changed. 1963, Jim Henson moved to New York City. He had lived in Maryland. 1963, Peter Schumann came to New York City. In New York City at the same time was Bert Tillstrop, was Frank Paris, was Shari Lewis. These are all the biggest names in puppetry were living in New York and kind of knew each other at that time. And puppetry was about, Jim wasn't famous yet, but boy did things change after that. Oh, at the same time, Nick was doing his work. So I told you Nick, who has the theater in Brooklyn, he became the lead puppeteer for Suzari, and then the company became the Nicolo Marionettes, named for him. And finally, around 1990, he was tired of touring and wanted to find a permanent space. So that's when he settled down in Brooklyn, and he does real traditional, straight-ahead fairy tales. And still does, and he's a superb, superb craftsman and a director. Now, there's two people who worked for him. One is Vince Anthony, who founded the Center for Puppetry Arts in Atlanta. Nick gave him his first job in New York. And the other one who he worked with was a puppeteer named Wayland Flowers, who became pretty famous. So the late 60s is when the Bread and Puppets started doing their big parades. 68, they did a tour of Europe, and they became very, very famous. And then in 69, Sesame Street became very, very famous. So the two real influential puppeteers in the world, Henson and Schumann, really started to come on the scene at the end of the 60s and into the 70s. That's the Washerwoman. 1970 was my first puppet festival. I had gotten out of college. I had my first car. It was a 12-year-old car, and my first road trip was to Connecticut to that festival. And at that festival was Jim Henson, Carol Spinney was the director, Rod Young, a great his puppet historian who lived in New York, was there. There was a company called the B. Gay Puppeteers, B. Zeller and Ann Cohen. They were Bridge and Tunnel. They lived across the river in Bayonne. But they were very, very well-known puppeteers all over New York. And they did lovely, lovely hand puppet shows. And there were a couple other, there was a company called Pickwick. Larry Berthelsen did these beautiful rod puppets, and then he trained a guy named Ken Moses who took over his company. So they were all going in 1970. And the Muppets got going. Now this is a recent cover of Puppetry Journal, but Sesame Street did start in 1969, and then has really, really dominated the field of puppetry since then. But other things were happening. 1974, Ralph Lee began the Greenwich Village Halloween Parade, which is another thing that's become part of New York history. And there's Wayland. In 1971, at the Village Gate, he premiered Madam. The director of that show was Nick Coppola. And of course, he went on to really bring sort of risque adult puppetry to television. This young puppeteer who had just come back from Bali in 1980, nobody knew who she was. Her name was Julie Taymor. This was the first show she did in New York. And she was a downtown puppeteer for 17 years before Lion King came along. And the gossip I remember was, how is this going to work, this downtown girl in Disney? This is not a match. This is like doomed to failure. This isn't going to work. And they did Lion King, which is the show that has, the only Broadway show ever to earn $1 billion. This is also pre-Lion King. This is a lovely show she did called Wandarian. Then 1982, in, again, Greenwich Village, the theater on 2nd Avenue, this show came along, and the designer of that show is Marty Robinson, who also went on to work for the Muppets. He worked on Sesame. He's still on Sesame, and he's a brilliant puppeteer. 20 years later, this got to Broadway. But this ran for 5 years off Broadway. It had off-Broadway records. And Roman Pascoe was running around in the early 80s. Then the baby boomers started to all emerge. And there were a lot of baby boomers who were doing puppetry. Roman had a worldwide reputation. Paul Zaloom left Bread and Puppet, and he did this wonderful antic, crazy things in the village at in East Village. East Village was bigger at that point. I did, that was all I'm going to say for the 80s. 1992, now we're back to the first Jim Henson Festival. Jim has passed away. Cheryl and the Foundation did this festival. And it was amazing. And of the many, many puppeteers who performed at those 5 festivals, there were about 8 or 10 who were New Yorkers. And one was Lee Breuer, who did Mabou Mines, and Peter and Wendy performed at that festival. And it is amazing, amazing work of art.
Castle Twist performed in that also.
Yes, he did. That was his first year. Thank you. You're absolutely right. I have that in my notes. I'm trying to do all this from up here. And then in 2003, now we're only back 20 years ago, Avenue Q hit Broadway, which is another Broadway show that became quite a sensation. And John Tartaglia was nominated for Best Actor in a Broadway show. He didn't win that year, but it's the first time a puppeteer was nominated for that. A puppeteer at the Metropolitan Opera. They've done this in Madame Butterfly, season after season after season. This was a show called The Oldest Boy by a great playwright named Sarah Rule. And I saw this up at the Vivian Beaumont at Lincoln Center. And then Basil Twist came along in '97, and he was the next sort of fair-haired boy in puppetry. He was very, very prominent through, from 2000 on. He eventually won a MacArthur Genius Award. He's done a lot of operas and so forth in England now, in France and other places. And that's the last slide. So that's a real quick look at... Thank you. Yes. Now, the person who probably was best acquainted with Jim Henson's contribution to puppetry, which really came to dominate the world of puppetry, is his daughter, Heather Henson, and she's become a great, great supporter of the art form through the SLAM network and through the Jane Henson Foundation, and it is my great pleasure to introduce my friend Heather.
Thank you. I just love this community so much. I get so excited to be a part of this, to be a part of the fabric of this amazing tapestry of puppet history. I don't have any slides. I wish I did. It was kind of a last minute thing to add me to the roster, and I'm really excited to be here. I guess I'm kind of representing 2 generations of puppeteers in New York because, I am a 2nd generation puppeteer. My name is Heather Henson. I'm the youngest of Jim and Jane's kids. And I was born in, my dad, as you guys heard, this whole story of so I'm going to just try to get you into how my dad's relationship to New York City, and then I guess my relationship to New York City. So he moved up here. So my mom and dad started the Muppets down in Washington, D.C. They started with Sam and Friends. Actually, before that, but that was the show that made them famous, Sam and Friends. And then that show actually got canceled, and then they were doing advertisements, but down from Washington, D.C., and they were always traveling up to New York to work at NBC, the Today Show. They had little sections on NBC, and then they were doing a lot of variety shows, too. So they were always traveling in their car. They would fill their car up with puppets and drive all the way up here from D.C., and then they decided to, like I said, Sam and Friends got canceled. They were still doing advertising, so they decided to make the move up here. And they moved up here in 1963. So, and then they were able to do, they were able to do a lot of those Ed Sullivan Show directly from New York City, Today Show, and a lot of other, and then again, the advertising industry, this is where it was headquartered. So when they moved up here, it's lovely. Oh, Steve, your presentation was so amazing. So when they moved up here, they moved into, because they had been part of this community, and I think my dad really loved and embraced the puppet community. It's so interesting to see that history that my dad, he became president of Puppeteers of America, and then his first festival that he directed, the only festival he directed, was that Hurleyville festival in 63. Can't believe that all these things happened at the same time. So look at all those amazing people from New York that he presented, including Alfonso from Coney Island. That was so exciting to see. I love that. And Bread and Puppet. All these, like, this synergy of all that stuff that happened in that year. So when he moved up to New York, where was he going to move? Where his friends lived. He moved into the apartment in Beekman Place, where Bill Baird was living, and Bill Baird was in town, because normally Bill Baird lived in Chicago.
Telstra.
Oh my gosh, what am I doing? I can't believe it. Bert Tillstrom, I can't believe I just did that. Bert Tillstrom, I'm sorry, so he had a show on Broadway, so he was temporarily living in New York City, and so my dad moved into that apartment near there, and that's when Don Celine, so I'm going to be checking all my names, Don Celine was working for Bert Tillstrom. And then he became a puppet builder for my dad. But my dad had met him earlier at a puppet festival in Detroit. But this whole community, I think this community, all these amazing artists were living here and were networking, and he was a part of that. So I think my dad's work definitely changed when he came to New York City, because before he was working with, some of the puppeteers that he, some people had come to DC with him, because of course he met my mom there, and then Jerry Nelson was actually in DC. And Jerry Jewell moved to DC to work with my dad. But when he moved up here, he had met Frank earlier, but that's when Frank came to work with him, and these other, Don Celine. Don Celine really changed the look of my dad's puppets. It cleaned up the design. Carol Lee Wilcox was from New York. All these amazing designers and puppeteers then kind of all synergized here in New York. Okay. So super successful here. One thing is that he was always pitching all of his shows constantly. Like, he wanted to get Muppet Show going, so it was constantly these pitches. It's interesting, he moved to New York, but still so much of the filming continued in other places other than New York. He made Tales of Tinker-D. He went down to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to film that, because Diana Birkenfield was a producer for so anyway, he went down there and was able to shoot Tales of Tinker-D there with Jerry Jewell, and but he still, and then he was going up to Toronto to film things, and he still, nothing was getting filmed actually in New York. One of the pitches for the Muppet Show was filmed in New York, but then of course when he got New York Muppet Show, it was actually in London, and then he continued to do shows. Fraggle Rock, Muppet Show was in London, and then Dark Crystal was in London, and then Labyrinth was in London, and then Fraggle Rock was in Toronto. But he did get, before that, Sesame Street was in New York, and so that was a show that was like anchored here in New York. It took place here and it was filmed here, and that was like his New York thing. But it wasn't until later Muppets Take Manhattan in '84 that they finally were able to like shoot a big movie here in New York City, and that was really fun. But of course, Sesame Street was that regular thing all the time, and that was definitely headquartered in New York. Then I just want to jump to he created the Jim Henson Foundation when he was here in New York, and established with Nancy Staub, Leslie Ash, and then actually my mom became the director of it, and then after that, my sister became the director of it, and she really launched the Henson Foundation in a beautiful, beautiful direction. And then the International Puppet Festival. And that, I have to say, it started in 1992 after my dad passed away, but that was really his vision. My dad and Joseph Papp talked a lot about that. They really wanted to put that festival on. Sadly, both of them passed away before the first festival could happen. But it was really seeded with both of their visions. And that festival was amazing, and it's so cool to see all these puppet artists that my dad was able to see downtown, and then they were really able to highlight all those artists through the 90s in that puppet festival. Then I guess I moved to Orlando, Florida for a while and all that, but still I was interested in, I've been seeding like the Puppet Slam network. I started that when I was in Providence, kind of just making sure all these organizations were running Puppet Slams and then loving the Handmade Puppet Dreams. So we're continuing to do that. I'm in one of the buildings that my dad had bought in '84. We're in the Carriage House. It is a little 3-story carriage house building. We house the New York Puppet Guild of Puppetry, has their meetings there now. We seed a lot of Puppet Slams, spearheaded by Mr. Brendan Schweda right here. So Puppet Slam Network films, and then we do our own show. That's been happening, G-Jack on Turtle Island, the latest version of various shows. So New York has been very good to the Henson family. We love New York. It's been, like I said, it was really nice making that transition when I came back to New York. And then there is so much talent here. I think that these cities that have, these are like magnets for talent, and beautiful things can come out of that. And I think New York is definitely one of those cities. And I think it's really fun to be a part of the fabric of New York, puppetry in New York. So, thank you.
All right, and that is perfect timing. Thank you, Steve and Heather, for being so precise so that we can make it to the exhibit. It's really special to have this opening with this intimate crew. The crowd is going to grow through the day. Get ready. There is a team that you're about to meet putting on this exhibit next door, and then we'll all stroll down to the parachute jump and process with some puppets down the boardwalk. Tonight you'll see the Box Cutter Collective. If you've got your schedule at the registration table, be sure to get your handy schedule. This has got the entire weekend's activities. I will note that there's more activity after the parade that comes back here. A panel discussion about pageant puppets that will happen here at 3 p.m. A presentation, a kind of puppet lecture from Jamie Sunwoo about her Henson Foundation granted show SPAM, Specially Processed American Meat. Some puppet films will be happening here. Some regional puppeteers, about a half-hour block, including filmmakers like Sonia Sobieski, seated right over here. And then an hour block of handmade Puppet Dreams films that come from Heather's company. There's keep in mind for scheduling, there's a 6:30 till 7 p.m. break, so maybe you want to, and we have a pretty big kind of lunch break if you want to grab anything, or you do what you will to nourish yourself at 7 p.m. Filmmaker, puppeteer, National Capital puppet, former president, a many-hatted puppet friend, Jeff Bragg, has made a beautiful film about puppeteer Hobie Ford that will screen at 7, and that will move right into the Box Cutter Show. After the Box Cutter Show, Pugogny, the Puppetry Guild of Greater New York, will be celebrating the 60th anniversary downstairs in the Freak Bar, and then a lot more to come throughout the weekend. So make sure you get your schedule. Registration is going to be set up many hours at that front desk if you have any questions. And I think at our leisure, we are welcome to make our way next door for the opening of the festival exhibit. So thank you for this opening, and let's make our way.